A castle under siege. The air in the castle had changed. Ellie could feel it as soon as they returned from the collapsed tunnels. The silence, once solemn and heavy, now bristled with an undercurrent of energy, like the calm before a storm. Ellie and Callum climbed the spiral stone staircase to the research office, their boots echoing loudly in the confined space. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the castle were resisting their presence. "You're sure we're not cursed now?" Callum muttered, glancing nervously at the flickering torch sconces lining the walls. Ellie didn't answer. Her mind was still racing with the Piper's vision and the ominous growls that had chased them through the tunnels. Whatever they had disturbed below was not content to remain hidden. When they entered the office, Ellie dropped her bag on the table and immediately began sorting through her notes. Callum, meanwhile, leaned against the door, his arms crossed tightly across his chest. "What's the plan?" he asked. "Because I think leaving and never coming back sounds pretty good right about now." Ellie looked up at him, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion. "We can't leave. Not yet. If we don't figure out what's happening here, more people could get hurt." Before Callum could respond, the door behind him slammed shut with a deafening bang. The first signs. Callum jumped, spinning around to face the door. What the hell was that? Ellie stood frozen, her eyes wide. "I didn't touch it." The door remained closed, but the air in the room had grown colder. Their breaths formed invisible puffs, and the faint sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway outside. "There's no one out there," Callum said, his voice shaking. Ellie grabbed a flashlight and stepped toward the door. "Stay here," she said, though her voice betrayed her own unease. "Not a chance," Callum said, following close behind. Ellie opened the door cautiously, her flashlight beam sweeping the corridor. It was empty, the flickering torches casting long shadows on the stone walls. But the sound of footsteps persisted, moving further down the hall. "They're leading us somewhere," Ellie said. "Or luring us into a trap," Callum muttered. "A haunting presence." They followed the sound of the footsteps, their flashlights slicing through the dim corridors. The air grew colder with each step, and Ellie felt a growing sense of unease. When they turned a corner, the sound abruptly stopped. They stood in a long, empty hallway lined with suits of armor and ancient tapestries. The stillness was oppressive, as though the castle itself were holding its breath. Then, without warning, one of the suits of armor toppled over with a deafening crash. Ellie and Callum jumped back, their flashlights darting toward the source of the noise. The armor lay in a heap on the floor, its pieces scattered like the remnants of a fallen soldier. "That's it," Callum said, his voice trembling. "We're leaving." But before they could turn back, the torches along the hallway flared brightly, their flames casting unnatural shadows on the walls. One of the shadows moved. Ellie's heart raced as she saw the outline of a figure, tall and thin, with sharp angles that seemed to distort unnaturally as it moved closer. "It's not real," Callum whispered, though his voice was filled with doubt. The figure stopped a few feet away, its hollow eyes locking onto Ellie. She felt a cold wave wash over her, freezing her in place. "Who are you?" she managed to ask, her voice trembling. The shadow didn't respond. Instead, it raised an arm, pointing toward a nearby door. The room of shadows. Ellie and Callum exchanged uneasy glances before approaching the door. It was old and heavy, its surface carved with intricate patterns that seemed to writhe in the flickering torchlight. Ellie reached for the handle, hesitating for a moment before pushing it open. The door creaked loudly, revealing a small chamber filled with dust and cobwebs. At first, the room appeared empty, but as Ellie stepped inside, she noticed an old wooden table at the center. On it rested a single, ornate mirror. The mirror's surface was cracked, its silvered backing tarnished and peeling. Yet, despite its age, the reflection was clear. Too clear. Ellie could see herself and Callum, but the room behind them appeared different. "Do you see that?" Ellie whispered. Callum nodded, his face pale. The reflection. It's not the same as the room. In the mirror, the chamber was alive with movement. Shadows flitted across the walls, and faint figures moved in the background, their faces indistinct. Ellie stepped closer, her reflection mirroring her every movement. As she leaned in, the glass suddenly rippled, and an icy hand shot out from the surface, grabbing her wrist. The attack! Ellie screamed, stumbling backward as the hand pulled her toward the mirror. Callum grabbed her arm, yanking her free, just as the hand retreated into the glass. The mirror's surface returned to its cracked stillness, but the air in the room had grown colder, and the shadows seemed to press closer. "Are you okay?" Callum asked, his voice frantic. Ellie nodded, though her wrist throbbed where the hand had grabbed her. A faint, dark bruise was already forming, its shape eerily like a claw. "We need to leave this room," Callum said, pulling her toward the door. But as they turned to leave, the door slammed shut, and the torches in the hallway extinguished, plunging them into darkness. A castle in chaos. The next few moments were a blur of chaos. Objects in the room began to move on their own, the table flipping violently, and the mirror shattering into pieces. The shards hovered in the air for a moment before flying toward Ellie and Callum like projectiles. "Down!" Ellie shouted, ducking behind an overturned chair. The shards embedded themselves in the walls, their edges gleaming menacingly in the faint light. The shadows in the room grew thicker, coalescing into a single, massive figure that loomed over them. It let out a guttural growl, the sound reverberating through the room. Ellie felt her chest tighten, her breaths coming in short gasps. "What is that?" Callum shouted, his voice barely audible over the noise. Ellie didn't answer. She grabbed a flashlight and shone it at the figure, the beam slicing through its form. The creature recoiled, its shadowy edges dissolving slightly under the light. "Keep it in the light," Ellie yelled. Callum fumbled for his flashlight, aiming it at the creature. Together, their beams forced the shadow back, its form shrinking as it retreated toward the far corner of the room. A narrow escape. The creature let out a final, anguished roar before dissolving completely, leaving the room eerily silent. The torches flickered back to life, their flames casting soft, warm light on the now still chamber. Ellie and Callum sat on the floor, their breaths ragged as they tried to process what had just happened. "That was too close," Callum said, his voice shaking. Ellie nodded, her hands trembling as she picked up a piece of the shattered mirror. Its surface reflected her face, but in the background, she thought she saw a faint figure watching her, silent and waiting. "This isn't over," Ellie said softly. Callum groaned. "It never is it?" Ellie stood, her gaze fixed on the remnants of the mirror. "The castle is fighting back. Whatever we disturbed in the vaults, it's spreading, and we're running out of time to stop it." The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to shift as she spoke, as if listening. "We need answers," Ellie said, her voice filled with determination. "And we're not leaving until we find them." A living castle. The air in the room felt heavy, as though it had thickened into something tangible. Ellie stood by the shattered remnants of the mirror, her fingers brushing against the cool, jagged shards. Her reflection stared back at her, fragmented and distorted. She could still feel the icy grip of the hand that had emerged from the glass, its touch lingering on her skin like a brand. Callum paced behind her, his face pale and drawn. "Tell me you've got an explanation for this," he said, his voice tight. "Because I'm starting to think we're in a horror movie, and we didn't even get a script." Ellie didn't respond immediately. Her mind raced as she pieced together the events of the past few days. The whispers in the vaults, the Piper's warning, the violent outbursts of paranormal activity. Each incident seemed connected, part of a larger pattern she was only beginning to understand. "I don't think it's just ghosts," Ellie said finally, her voice low. Callum stopped pacing and turned to face her. "What does that mean?" Ellie glanced around the room, her gaze lingering on the walls, the floor, the very stones that surrounded them. "I think the castle is alive. A sentient fortress." Callum blinked, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to process her words. "Alive? Like a giant monster?" Ellie shook her head. "Not in the way you're thinking. Not physically alive. But it's aware. It feels. It reacts." Callum ran a hand through his hair, his expression a mix of disbelief and fear. You're saying the castle knows we're here? Yes, Ellie said, her tone resolute. And I think it feeds on fear and despair. Every tragedy that's happened here, the betrayals, the deaths, the curses, it's like fuel for the castle. It absorbs that energy and uses it to grow stronger. Callum let out a hollow laugh. So what? We're trapped inside some kind of haunted sponge. Ellie ignored his sarcasm, her mind racing as she pieced together the implications of her theory. Think about it, she said. The Black Dinner, the Piper's disappearance, the plague victims sealed in the vaults. They all left behind fear, anger, and sorrow. Those emotions lingered, and the castle fed on them. That's why the activity is escalating. We've disturbed something deep within its foundation. Callum stared at her, his skepticism faltering. If that's true, what do we do about it? Signs of awareness. The castle itself seemed to answer his question. The temperature in the room dropped suddenly, and the torches lining the walls flickered violently. The faint sound of whispers returned, their cadence rising and falling like a twisted lullaby. Ellie stepped closer to the wall, her flashlight illuminating the worn stones. It's responding to us, she said, her breath visible in the frigid air. It knows we're here. The whispers grew louder, forming a chorus of indistinct voices. Ellie closed her eyes, focusing on the emotions behind the sounds rather than the words. She felt waves of anger, grief, and fear washing over her, each one more intense than the last. It's not just reacting, she said softly. It's trying to communicate. Callum frowned. And what's it saying? Get out before we eat you. Ellie turned to him, her expression somber. No, it's warning us. Memories in stone. Ellie's hands pressed against the cold wall, her fingers brushing over the ancient carvings etched into the stone. The markings were faint but deliberate, their patterns forming a language she couldn't quite decipher. Every stone in this castle has a story, Ellie said, her voice barely above a whisper. If the castle is sentient, then these walls are its memories. Callum moved closer, his flashlight illuminating the carvings. You think the castle remembers everything that's happened here? Ellie nodded. It doesn't just remember, it holds on to it. The emotions, the pain, the fear, it's all stored here, like an archive of suffering. She closed her eyes, letting her hand linger on the wall. Images began to flicker in her mind, fleeting, fragmented glimpses of the past. She saw soldiers marching through the castle gates, their faces grim and determined. She saw the Douglas brothers at the Black Dinner, their smiles fading as betrayal unfolded around them. And she saw the Piper, his face etched with fear as he descended into the tunnels. The visions faded, leaving Ellie breathless. It's showing me what it's seen, she said, her voice trembling. It's trying to make me understand the castle's pain. As Ellie stepped back from the wall, the whispers surged, filling the room with a cacophony of voices. The sound was almost unbearable, a relentless tide of anguish and despair. Callum clapped his hands over his ears. Make it stop, he shouted. Ellie focused on the emotions behind the whispers, searching for a thread of meaning. Beneath the anger and fear, she sensed something else, something deeper. It's not just feeding on pain, she said, her voice strained. It's trapped in it. Callum lowered his hands, his brow furrowing. Trapped? Ellie nodded. The castle isn't just alive, it's suffering. It's been consumed by all the pain it's absorbed over the centuries. That's why it lashes out. It's trying to release what it's holding. The whispers began to fade, replaced by a deep, resonant hum that seemed to emanate from the very stones. The floor beneath them trembled slightly, and Ellie felt a surge of urgency. We have to help it, she said, turning to Callum. Callum stared at her in disbelief. Help it? Ellie, it's a castle. A haunted castle that's trying to kill us. Ellie's gaze hardened. It's not trying to kill us. It's trying to survive. If we can find a way to release the pain it's holding, we might be able to stop this. A plan to heal. Ellie grabbed her notebook and began sketching a rough map of the castle, marking the locations of the vaults, the Great Hall, and the other areas where paranormal activity had been strongest. These are the places where the most pain was concentrated, she said, pointing to the map. If we can trace the connections between them, we might be able to find the source. The heart of the castle's sentience. Callum shook his head, pacing the room. And what happens when we find it? Do we just ask it nicely to stop being haunted? Ellie didn't answer. She didn't know what they would find at the castle's heart, or if they would survive it, but she knew they had to try. The castle strikes back. As they prepared to leave the room, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang, and the torches extinguished simultaneously, plunging them into darkness. Ellie's flashlight flickered, and she felt the air grow colder. The whispers returned, louder and more chaotic than before, as though the castle were resisting their efforts. "We have to move," Ellie said, her voice firm. Callum nodded, gripping his flashlight tightly. "Lead the way." They pushed the door open and stepped into the corridor, the walls trembling as the whispers followed them. The castle seemed to shift around them, its layout twisting and distorting as though trying to trap them. Ellie's pulse quickened as she realized the castle wasn't just reacting. It was fighting back. "Stay close," she said, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her. "We're going to find the heart of this place, and we're going to set it free." An unseen attack. Ellie and Callum hurried down the dimly lit corridor, their flashlights cutting through the gloom. The castle seemed to vibrate with a low, ominous energy, its walls groaning as though alive. Every step echoed loudly, the sound swallowed quickly by the oppressive silence. As they rounded a corner, the flicker of movement caught Ellie's eye. A figure stood at the far end of the hall, their features partially obscured by shadow. Ellie stopped, her heart skipping a beat. But then the figure stepped forward, revealing a familiar face. "Dr. Alan Royce," Ellie said, relief flooding her voice. Dr. Royce, a local historian with an infamous disdain for ghost stories, adjusted his glasses and gave her a disapproving look. His tweed jacket was slightly rumpled, and he clutched a leather satchel to his chest. "You've dragged me into quite the mess, haven't you?" Royce said, his tone clipped. Callum snorted. "Nice to see you too, Document. What are you doing here?" Royce gave a tight smile. "After your frantic call about living castles and ghostly Piper warnings, I thought I'd better see this nonsense for myself. If only to make sure you weren't desecrating Scotland's finest historical site." Ellie frowned. "We didn't call you here to debunk anything. There's something real happening, and it's dangerous. You shouldn't have come." Royce waved a dismissive hand. "Please, these old stones creak and groan. It's natural. You're letting superstition cloud your judgment." As if in response, a loud crash echoed down the hallway, causing all three to flinch. Royce adjusted his glasses, his bravado faltering. "What was that?" he asked, his voice tight. Ellie's flashlight darted to the source of the sound, but the corridor was empty. "That's what we're trying to figure out," she said. "Skeptic meets supernatural." Despite his skepticism, Royce agreed to follow them into the main hall, where Ellie had begun piecing together the castle's dark history. The air grew colder as they walked, and the torches along the walls flickered erratically. Ellie stopped in front of a large tapestry depicting a battle scene. She pointed to the corner of the fabric, where a faint, almost imperceptible symbol was woven into the pattern. "These markings," she said, tracing the design with her finger. "They're everywhere. I think they're tied to the castle's sentience. If we can decipher them, we might be able to find a way to stop this." Royce leaned in to examine the symbol, his skepticism momentarily replaced by curiosity. "Interesting," he muttered. "This design is far older than the tapestry itself. It looks almost Pictish." Before Ellie could respond, the air in the room shifted. A low, guttural growl echoed through the hall, and the temperature plummeted. Callum's flashlight flickered. Guys," he said, his voice trembling. The growl grew louder, resonating through the stone walls. Royce stepped back, his face pale. "What is that?" Ellie scanned the room, her heart pounding. The shadows along the edges of the hall began to move, coalescing into indistinct forms. "Stay close," Ellie said, her voice steady despite the fear building in her chest. The attack. The shadows surged forward without warning, their forms twisting and writhing like smoke. Ellie grabbed Royce's arm, pulling him back as one of the shapes lunged at him. The historian stumbled, his satchel falling to the ground as he struggled to regain his footing. "What in God's name?" Royce began, but his words were cut off as an unseen force slammed into him, throwing him against the wall. "Royce!" Ellie shouted, rushing to his side. The historian writhed on the floor, his face contorted in pain. Invisible hands seemed to grip his limbs, pinning him down as he gasped for air. His eyes darted wildly, his mouth forming silent words. Callum swung his flashlight wildly, the beam slicing through the shadows. "Get off him!" he yelled, though his voice betrayed his panic. Ellie dropped to her knees beside Royce, grabbing his shoulders. "Stay with me, Alan," she said, her voice desperate. The growling intensified, and Royce's body convulsed as though a great weight were pressing down on him. Ellie's flashlight caught the faint outline of a shadowy figure standing over him, its form indistinct but menacing. "Let him go!" Ellie shouted, her voice echoing through the hall. A desperate move. Acting on instinct, Ellie reached into Royce's satchel and pulled out a small iron medallion engraved with Celtic designs. It was one of his prized artifacts, a relic he often carried for lectures. She pressed the medallion against Royce's chest, and the reaction was immediate. The shadowy figure recoiled, letting out a piercing scream that reverberated through the hall. The air around them grew lighter, and the shadows began to dissipate. Royce gasped, his chest heaving as he clutched the medallion. Ellie helped him sit up, her hands shaking. What just happened?" Royce stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. Ellie glanced at the medallion, her mind racing. "Iron," she said. "It's a conductor. It disrupts whatever energy they're made of." Callum helped Royce to his feet, his own face pale. "We need more than that medallion if those things come back." Ellie nodded, her gaze drifting to the tapestry. "The symbols might be the key. If we can decipher them, we might be able to protect ourselves, or even stop the castle entirely." A change in perspective. Royce, still clutching the medallion, gave Ellie a wary look. "You're serious about this, aren't you?" Ellie met his gaze, her expression firm. "Do you believe me now?" Royce hesitated, his usual bravado replaced by a quiet resignation. "I don't know what I believe anymore, but I can't deny what just happened." Callum smirked despite the tension. "Welcome to the club, document. You get used to it." "Sort of." Ellie turned back to the tapestry, her resolve hardening. "We need to figure out what these symbols mean. If they're connected to the castle's sentience, they might be our only chance." Royce adjusted his glasses, his scholarly instincts kicking in despite his lingering fear. "If they're Pictish, there might be records or translations in the castle's archives, but finding them won't be easy." Ellie nodded. "Then we'd better start looking." The castle strikes back. As they prepared to leave the hall, the air grew heavy once more, and the torches flickered ominously. The castle seemed to sense their intent, its walls groaning as though in protest. "Looks like it doesn't want us figuring this out," Callum said, glancing nervously at the shifting shadows. Ellie gripped the medallion tightly, her jaw set with determination. "Too bad. We're not stopping now." The growling returned, louder and more aggressive than before. Ellie felt a surge of fear, but pushed it aside, focusing on the task ahead. The castle was alive, sentient and angry, but it wasn't unbeatable. As they moved toward the archives, the shadows followed, their presence a constant reminder of the stakes. The castle had made its move, and Ellie knew the next would be hers.